I'll first begin by discussing my opponent's case and then moving back on to our own. First, go to the argument on the first disad about the affirmative being too abstract. The affirmative does not advocate culture in the abstract. Actually, we're probably the least abstract team in this round. Our affirmative exposes the truth and makes people realize that culture is being devalued by globalization and economic theories. In addition, we affirm the resolution that policies should be implemented to protect cultural diversity. We give two specific examples of this. First, the Olympic Games, and second, artistic cultural communities. They have not addressed our second example. Also, the resolution does not ask for a specific policy to be implemented by a specific country. No, the resolution simply states the affirmative should advocate the protection of cultural diversity, which we do. And even if it did ask for specific implementation, then what would that mean? The affirmative knows that advocating a specific policy does not mean it will get enacted, which means that the only benefit that we get from this debate is that we learn how to better situate ourselves in respect to culture. This is why we choose to explain and critique how culture is valued in the status quo. The negative has agreed with too much. They've agreed with the way that we have explained the status quo. We believe this is a reason for you to vote affirmative. The only benefit that the debaters and judges get after this round is we find a new way to situate ourselves in the world. You learn not to take culture for granted and not to devalue it. If you agree with how the affirmative has described the status quo, then this is a reason to vote affirmative independent from the rest of the negative's arguments, because there's only a chance that we move away from the status quo into a world that doesn't devalue and quantify culture. Next, on the rest of the arguments on the disad, they're simply not true. First, if policies are meant to actually increase cultural diversity, then there is no way that they'll promote this state-specific culture as they suggest. If the focus is to increase diversity, that means that a state will be multicultural, not unicultural. Second, culture is being devalued in the status quo. The first affirmative speech made that clear, and the negative has conceded and agreed that culture is being devalued already. Third, the affirmative believes that the negative consequences of the disadvantage are occurring in the status quo, but we don't agree with the root cause. We believe that the root cause of culture being devalued is capitalism, and we give reasons why the affirmative could solve this problem. Fourth, and even if we're wrong about the root cause, the state isn't some abstract notion. States are made up of individuals. If you vote affirmative and advocate the affirmative, then these individuals will no longer devalue culture. Instead, these individuals would value, protect, and promote cultural diversity, which means that the disadvantage would never occur in a world where people actually value culture. In contrast, the negative only devalues culture, insofar as the more they emphasize the monetary value of goods, the more insincere and corruptible those goods become. This means that if they are right, the state devalues culture, then we would be able to better solve that problem by changing the relationship between people and culture. Next, on the second disadvantage. Their reasons to prefer globalization over protecting cultural diversity mean nothing in the round if we're winning the argument that globalization and capitalism are at the forefront of devaluing culture in our everyday lives. Specifically, our opponents claim that the state-sanctioned protectionist policies prevent various aspects of culture from being recognized in ways that globalization remedy. They fail to understand our arguments coming out of the first speech, specifically our McGregor evidence, which when uncontested argues that capitalism and the economic machine actually decreases the meaning of life by focusing on ownership and consumption. Rather, their emphasis on global markets to dictate the value of cultural goods is actually what the affirmative critiques. The negative couldn't merely value art for its own sake, but be forced to question how much the piece is worth and how it fits into our consumerist society. In this sense, the negative advances an insincere, inauthentic form of culture that has little to no value. We instead choose to endorse a culture in a way that goes beyond actual measurement and the quantifying of how much cultural goods are worth. Lastly, they make the argument that cultural exceptionalism justifies protectionism, even when it isn't necessary. This argument leaves no room for protecting culture from the outside influences of the economy, which is necessary in a world that emphasizes consumption and ownership. In addition, cultures only use protectionist policies when they feel threatened. They give no justification as to why cultures would adopt protectionist policies, absent economic or other forces that require them to do so. It would be absurd to believe nations to protect certain goods if they meant little or nothing to that state. Lastly, we're going to go back to the affirmative case and a way to evaluate the round. At the end of the round, if the affirmative is the team that provides the best option for valuing culture, then you vote affirmative. The negative has taken a position with their free trade argument. They have stated that protecting culture will derail free trade, and hence that free trade is preferable to the protection of culture. These are two competing positions, the two choices you have to vote at the end of the round. You can choose to negate, which means you choose to allow cultures to be quantified and devalued by free trade, or you can affirm because we provided you with a way to step away from the status quo, a way to value culture for what it really is. The negative will probably try to convince you that we would derail free trade more than anyone in the world. But honestly, we're just two college students trying to convince you that culture is devalued in the status quo, and then we need to do something about it. We prove to you that valuing cultural goods economically diminishes social and cultural values. That's our conceded Dale evidence. You can vote off this argument alone, as the more we emphasize the monetary value of culture goods, the more insincere and inauthentic those cultural goods ultimately become. Lastly, they concede our claimer evidence, which states instead of viewing art in economic terms, we ought to value for its aesthetics and the meaning that it generates. This is a clear example of when protectionist policies are needed to prevent economic forces from devaluing goods. Don't let them answer this evidence in their next speech. They had ample time and we don't get another speech. Claimer's example of why art shouldn't be quantified is a clear reason to vote for the affirmative. We have a specific, uncontested example of how we affirm the resolution with the discussion of protecting cultural diversity, and more specifically, the discussion of protecting art. The affirmative goes largely uncontested. Don't let them make any new or unfair arguments in their next speech. You can vote off of the uncontested art example. This is a clear example in which protectionist policies are actually needed.